Thank you so very much. I'm so thrilled to be able to introduce this evening my friends Stephanie Coleman and Robert Vargas. And I'm going to say the things that they told me I could say about them and a few things that I want to say about them. Stephanie Coleman directed me to talk about the work that she does in research and reform efforts, both in juvenile and in adult criminal justice, and that she particularly works to reduce the use of ineffective policies designed for adults and have those policies applied to children. That's a particular area of concern for her. She works with not-for-profits, with academics, with all kinds of people, and it really is very well known in the area of criminal justice reform. What I have to say especially about Stephanie is that she has a gift for explaining complicated issues so that normal people can understand them. And the push to be understandable does not dominate academia, and it is in fact actively discouraged in law schools. So she really has performed enormous public service by tackling very difficult issues. For example, what is a gun charge in regard to a juvenile? And to take apart issues that are very frightening and show what's really involved, and that there is a whole there are different levels of human behavior being sanctioned and how we should be careful. So I'm an enormous fan of Stephanie Coleman. Robert Vargas teaches at the University of Chicago. He's a sociologist, and he wanted me to talk about the fact that he's a native of Chicago, and he looks at how local government shapes a community's ability to respond to and to reduce violence. And that he's particularly interested in how what local government does makes it easier for a community to respond effectively to violence and how it makes it harder. What I was not authorized to say was that he is the author of a wonderful book called Wounded City, Violent Turf Wars in a Chicago Burial. And I really recommend this book. It's written in very sensible, straightforward English. It's dealing with, in very specific terms, how communities block by block are able to respond to violence effectively or are not able to respond to violence effectively. It looks at the roles of local government and at the same time of not-for-profit organizations and community-directed efforts. So you see the full response that we're making to violence on a block by block level. And I think it's something that anybody who's interested in improving life in our city would want to read. And it's in paperback, reasonably priced, very prestigious Oxford University Press edition. So that's what I wanted to say about the two of them. And I'm going to ask each of them to talk a little bit as they feel comfortable about what is happening with carjacking. And of course, I'm going to say on behalf of everyone that no one minimizes that carjacking is a very disturbing offense. It is of great concern to us, all of us as citizens, as residents, as parents in the city of Chicago, that we should have carjacking, and that some of the people involved in the carjacking are very, very young. And this is very deeply troubling and something that calls for a response. But I want to ask people, this is not going to be a ladies first thing. I'm going to ask Robert to talk to us first about what is actually happening in Chicago with carjacking. What does the data show? And data is what social scientists call the facts. So I want to know, what is data telling us about carjacking right now? And then how is that being presented to the public Are we getting the best picture of how that's being presented? After that, I'd like to ask Stephanie to respond and talk about how some of the reaction that we're seeing to the carjackings raises the possibility that we're going to have some very bad responses in terms of how we're going to try to handle carjacking, how we're going to respond to it as a community. So that's what I'd like the two of them to speak, to ask Robert to talk first about carjacking, and then ask Stephanie to share with us some insights about how the some parts of the public response to carjacking may lead us to enact the kind of legal initiatives that are not going to help us. So Robert, if you'd be willing to take over.
Yes, thank you for that introduction. And thank you for the invitation for being here. On the topic of data, so one of the first things that most researchers teach their students is that what matters often is the question that you ask, and then how you then use that to inform how you use data. And what's been happening with carjacking in the city of Chicago is that our city leaders and the police department have been asking the wrong questions. In fact, I would argue that they are asking questions with preconceived notions and biases and particular political agendas to frame the issue in a way that centers the police as being the necessary primary public health response, and sidelighting all of the efforts being made recently to try and replace the police with an alternative form of public safety provision and institutions. And there are a couple of ways that they're doing this. One is this argument that carjacking is a youth issue, a youth of color issue, and that it needs to be addressed through programming for youth, or if you're on the right side of the political aisle, it's enhanced sentences for young people. The Chicago Police Department is basing this argument off of where they're basing this argument in a scenario where they only have information on 13% of the folks who have been arrested for carjacking. So let me put this in perspective for you. If the US government was studying COVID-19 victims or vaccinations and saying, okay, we're gonna devise policy based on 13% of the people who have ever contracted COVID-19 or who have ever gotten the vaccine, you would think that they are lunatics, right? You would not trust them to do anything for you or for your community. Well, right now, we're trusting the mayor's office and the police department with devising a policy based on an egregious misuse of data that anyone with a basic understanding of statistics and social science would just think is just flat out wrong. Second is they're creating this myth that anyone can be a victim of a carjacking anywhere and at any time. And using data available on the Chicago Data Portal, I, along with some research assistants, crunched some very basic numbers, looking at the trends of where carjacking has been most concentrated and when does it tend to happen. And it turns out that the majority have been happening in some of the city's lowest income Black and Latino neighborhoods on the south and west sides. In fact, not the north side and the places where media coverage would lead you to believe that these events are happening far too often in predominantly white areas of the city, when the data again show that that's not the case. But again, radio silence on that issue from our city leaders. And third is basically again, this is back to the point about the questions that you ask. One of the questions that the city has seemed to have had little interest in answering is what percentage of cars have been recovered during a carjacking. And the reason why this is crucial is because if you look at the FBI website and the issue of carjacking as how the FBI views it, the FBI views it as an issue of organized crime, because through different forms of technology and manipulation, folks are able to manipulate the identities of cars and the VIN numbers in a way that they enable cars that are stolen to be sold in other states. And so what that means is that there's an alternative explanation and an alternative motivation for what's happening right now, which is an economic motivation, which makes sense given that the US is experiencing the largest economic crisis it has seen since the Great Depression. But we are left with, researchers like myself are left with very little to do in response to this narrative, because the Chicago police and the mayor's office own access to these data and don't make that the fine level data available for researchers to get at the deep nuances and to ask different questions than the ones that city leaders want you to focus on. And to just wrap up, that all of this is, in my view, a perfectly predictable and understandable response on behalf of an organization that for the first time in probably 50 years came the closest it has ever come to seeing a decrease in its budget. And one of the calling card tactics in the sociology of organizations, rule number one, organizations try to preserve themselves. That's their first goal as an organization. And so when an organization like the police department is under threat, there is an incentive to make themselves be viewed as the primary required solution to a problem. And I'll just end on that note and pass it over to Stephanie.
Thank you, Robert and Rebecca. And I'm really happy to be here. I really respect the work that you all do in maintaining independent political analyses and organizations. I think it's crucial. I want to echo everything that Robert said, including the idea that the Chicago Police Department is seeking above all else to maintain its power and its budget. It is a very long-standing place where clout hiring, political hiring has continued unabated for decades, and not just hiring, but promotion. And I think that's an important lens to sort of bring to bear here that might be relevant to your interests. Why is this concerning? When young people become the focus of civic attention in a relentless and negative manner, as is currently happening, we can see many ways that this is actually starting to tear at the fabric of Chicago and turn people in their everyday life and their choices against teenagers. This generation of young people is being asked to do things that we have not asked any other generation in recent memory anyway to accomplish. And they are doing a pretty impressive job at it. Considering the intense stress that their families are going through with loss of jobs, loss of loved ones, considering the fact that they are prevented from going to school in many cases physically, that they don't, despite efforts, have reliable internet access in their homes to continue classes in many cases. The fact that young people aged 16 to 25 were largely left out of the first few stimulus payments, which puts incredible stress on families. Even if they're still living at home, that payment doesn't go to the family. Just the combination, they tend to work, young adults do, in the kinds of jobs that were most impacted by COVID. And so the idea that this generation that has been under incredible stress at a time when in their life, in everyone's life, including ours, right? We were all once this age, and it is developmentally appropriate at this age to turn toward your peers for connection. And those connections have been frequently disrupted during this period. And so it is exceptionally difficult on them. And unfortunately, what's happening is that they've been exceptionally vilified in the media, such that I fear many more young people will see, many more Chicagoans will see young Black and Latino boys in particular, as a threat when they in fact are not. It's really a concerning moment. And especially as we are all mourning the loss of Adam, a 13-year-old boy from Little Village who was recently killed, I think we need to ask ourselves why young people are seen as special threats or being characterized as special threats by their own government at this time. This is an environment that echoes very much, the word carjacking comes from the super predator era. The super predator concept of the 80s and 90s, it was retracted by the researcher that advanced it, but that doesn't mean that that theory doesn't still put on its shoes and go to work every day in the way that people talk about crime and young people. There is no way that a young person becomes more adult in their thinking and their functioning by virtue of being involved in a serious offense. And while carjacking is a serious offense, it is one form of robbery, which is a very large category of crime that happens very frequently in many cities, but Chicago is no exception. And what isn't being talked about, I think, is even more interesting than what is being talked about. If I can just show you a quick slide, and I will wrap up because I'm sure there's many more questions that we want to get to from Rebecca, much less everyone else. Just want to show you what happened in recent years. Screen sharing is not as fast as I'd like. I'm not as fast as it as I'd prefer. Okay, so if I'm not currently covering this on your screen right now, I just want to point out that carjacking is a type of robbery, but when compared to all of the other types of robbery, what has happened is a massive decline in takings over the last several years. This is takings by force. That's the definition of a robbery, so it's different than a theft. Cars can, of course, also be stolen on the street, and most cars are stolen that way. But a carjacking and a robbery is a taking by the threat or use of force, which does not mean that someone was actually injured, but that a person was present at the time that the taking happened. And I just want to point out that although this term carjacking sounds very violent in its nature, and some carjackings may be violent, a third of them didn't involve a weapon or a particularly sensitive class of victim. And in fact, many of them didn't involve an injury at all. And when we're looking at what has been happening, I would say that a decrease in 4,000 robberies, including carjackings, over the last few years is a much bigger story than this uptick that we've seen temporarily. And before I turn it over, I just want to give us a small piece of good news, which is that although this data goes through 2020, and you have heard probably that there was an even bigger increase in the beginning of 2021, which is true. March data so far looks to be on par with previous years. From January to March of this year, 2021, it looks like we'll be on a track for about a 60% decrease in the number of vehicular hijackings that occurred.
I want to thank both of you very much, but I want to just take a moment here to ask one or two clarifying questions that have really troubled me personally, but I think maybe in the minds of some other people listening to the show. That first of all, that young people are taking cars as a way of going joyriding. And I remember joyriding when I was young. It was pretty old fashioned. So it's a pretty old fashioned concept that you would take a joyride in a car and abandon it. And so that the vehicular thefts are being driven by thrill-seeking youth. Could someone respond to, is there any reason to believe that joyriding is going on here and that this is driving theft? Robert, do you think that's the case? Are they finding the cars? My first question was, when I heard it was joyriding, is are they finding the cars after the joyrides?
I would say that it's unlikely. But ideally, one would have the data to be able to fully answer that question, but we don't. And the city is sitting on a lot of data that would enable many folks to answer all sorts of questions to clarify a lot of these concerns. Yeah, and yeah, on the joyriding angle, there was a Tribune article that interviewed a youth that had been arrested for carjacking, and the youth confessed to it being motivated by wanting to just beat boredom or something like this. So I just want to caution my folks in the audience of putting too much weight in any one particular case or news story that they read, because you have to remember that these are instances in the hundreds, sometimes if not the thousands, and relying on media narratives to make broader inferences and conclusions of patterns that are going on in the city is a really bad thing to do.
Well, now you've really embarrassed me because I'm planning to ask a question based on a personal narrative, but I already planned the question. So you're quite right. I'm a bad sociologist, but I've also, in the conversation about carjacking that's been occurring, have been worried that I was actually a bad parent. I raised two boys, and they delighted for many years in playing the game of Grand Theft Auto on the computer. And in fact, I was in a social situation. There's nothing like raising boys to subject you to occasional embarrassment. When the father of another boy came over to the house to pick up his son and take him home, and his son excitedly explained that my sons were allowed to play Grand Theft Auto, and wouldn't he like to see it on the screen? He was, of course, a Chicago police officer, and I was extremely embarrassed. That's what kids will do to you. So we've heard some questions that kids are being encouraged to consider theft by things like computer games. Stephanie, do you have any reaction to that?
Well, there aren't any studies that show a link between video games and violence. In fact, there are several that seem to indicate the converse is true. But I think blaming youth culture is part and parcel of blaming youth in particular for crimes. Crimes happen because of a social context, and they happen because of a developmental context. When we're talking about young people, and the combination of, some impulse control issues and risk taking that is developmentally appropriate, but may not be channeled in the right way, is channeled by, social circumstances that are outside of youth control and are fully within the control of adults. And so I think, it's fine and good for families to monitor and make decisions within their own households about media and children. But when it comes to blaming youth, delinquency and other harsh events on media consumption or participation in video games, there's nothing to support that.
Well, I will tell you that my son, the Grand Theft Auto player, went on to earn an undergraduate degree in computer engineering. And maybe he wouldn't have been that interested if it hadn't been for Grand Theft Auto.
Maybe Grand Theft Auto caused him to get the computer engineering degree.
I would love to say that was true because it would be so much fun, but his father was also a computer engineer, so it's hard to say that one with a straight face. Although it would be fun. So we have that. The last thing that I personally wanted to bring up, and I'm certainly, I can't tell if anyone's asked a question in chat, so someone else is going to have to raise that issue, is that this has also been presented to me recently. I was talking to a gentleman who's involved in community response, and he said that one of the most important things nowadays was to make sure that women in the community were not trying to pump gas. Because obviously any woman who attempts to pump her own gas is exposing herself to the risk of a carjacking. And I found that extremely disturbing as an idea that we would go out and tell women, don't pump your own gas, you might get carjacked. You better find some men who can do that for you. And I don't know if there's any evidence that women are more likely than men to be the victim of a carjacking, but it struck me as being a very troubling response to the existence of crime in our community. And I didn't know if either of you had any thoughts on that part of it. I'll ask Robert.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. It's troubling. I had said before to not put too much weight on any one observation. I would add an addendum to that to say that it's okay to have an observation motivate a question, that you then gather more data to then answer and clarify a hypothesis. And so I can say pretty firmly that the majority of carjackings have not occurred at gas stations, because my team mapped the location of the carjackings, and 62%, at least for ones that happened in 2020, happened on side streets. And so if we wanted to answer more of these questions, I mean, I can't specifically test that because, again, the city is sitting on the data with the detailed information to be able to answer all of the questions that folks would have. We map this by the time of the day. The hours between 5 p.m. and 2 a.m. are the times where they seem to be most concentrated. So yeah, I mean, and when folks are left without enough information, I mean, it's a classic finding in economics. People do all sorts of things when they don't have enough information. They do all sorts of irrational things and make bad choices. Yeah, if only we just wished it was different.
That's true. Can we talk for just a minute? I don't know if there's already a question in the chat, but about the economic side of carjacking. I was stunned as an older person to learn that there's no such thing as chop shops anymore, that cars can be easily resold after their, I guess you'd say in a sense, their identity is changed electronically. They can go and be sold, for example, in Indiana, where you can also go and buy guns easily, so that that a car can, if a car is stolen, it's very easy to resell it. I imagine that's a profitable business. And do we have any information about who's making money selling stolen cars, and if that money eventually gets in the hands of juveniles, or how that plays out?
I feel like I'll take this one. The answer is no, at least not publicly, right? So it's hard to tell what the Chicago Police Department might know about what happens to these vehicles after they are taken, both, and again, primarily off of the street, sometimes through a carjacking. What happens to a vehicle that's been stolen in the stream of commerce? How often is it located? How often is it actually returned to the owner? Which those are not the same thing either. Just because Chicago police find a stolen vehicle does not mean that it's actually reunited with its owner. So the question of whether there's an economic motive and incentive, again, I think it goes back to what Robert said about the clearance rates. And if we're looking at the actual cases, the percentage of cases that have been cleared, Chicago Police Department on the vehicular hijackings for 2020, actually, it's about 5% of the cases that involve an arrest. If the arrests, they're arresting about 3 people per case that they do close, so the arrest numbers look higher than they otherwise might be. But think about that for a minute, right? So if you're only catching 5% of the people, or 5% of the cases result in an arrest, it's not the hardest 5%, it's the easiest 5%, right? This is a sampling error that Robert was talking about earlier. And so this tends to over-involve young people because they don't pre-plan their crimes, right? And they don't necessarily have a getaway plan. They get stuck in traffic, or, the police superintendent brought up a situation where a young man had taken a car that was a manual transmission and he only knew how to drive automatic, right? Like these things pop up and then people are caught. They're not the best and most experienced, most professional 5% necessarily, right? And so young people may be over involved in that sample, but that doesn't mean that it's primarily young people who are doing the crime in general. So if there are people who are, involved in a more professionalized ring of thefts, we wouldn't have any information about those. Those are not people who are being apprehended. And we also don't know how many of the cars are recovered versus sold, or how they might be moving through the stream of commerce. So there's a lot of unknowns that I think police are asking us to fill in the gaps when they tell us, such a huge percentage of youth are being arrested for this crime. They expect us to extrapolate that to them being responsible for most of the crimes, when there's really not any reason to suppose that that's true.
Well, that's fascinating. I'm stunned. That's extremely interesting. And is the auto industry interested in pressing for more information about this, or not? Do we have any? Is there anybody else who wants to know who's stealing cars?
That's a great question. What I think about the chart that Stephanie put forth, which kind of put in perspective, like the scale of it, which really isn't that large, which again, I'm just hypothesizing here, but my sense is that if it's really that small, it's probably just a drop in the bucket for the auto industry, and they're probably not as concerned about the loss. They probably have a way to write it off from their taxes somehow. And the same holds with the FBI, right? Because if you think the FBI has limited time, they're probably focusing on a lot of domestic terrorism cases. They're probably pursuing the rise of white nationalism and the January 6th event. And when they go and they look at that graph, they probably think, well, in the greater scheme of things that the FBI ought to be devoting its time to, it's probably devoting its time to other things. And again, we're having this conversation again because cities, and particularly police departments, are facing a threat to their legitimacy and therefore their bottom line. And so they're really trying to cling to anything they possibly can to maintain the sense of a necessity that they have as a primary providers of public safety.
All right. We are going to start taking questions in the chat. I want to ask all of the participants tonight, if you have any questions, please put them in the chat. They will be read and recognized and responded to by the panelists. So Robert asked my wife's question about the FBI. So the next question is, what is driving the media narrative on this? Is it people who feel this is an outrage because they should be immune to crime? Or is it something more nefarious, like a desire to get touch on young people as a reactionary response to the move for police reform? Any one of you can answer the questions as they're posed.
I'll go first on that one. I think that both of those seem like likely reasons to me. I'm not exactly sure what is behind the media narrative, other than the fact that police have been actively shopping this narrative to the media. I don't know why it is so powerful to focus on this one subset of robbery as opposed to all of the robberies that are or are not happening in the city of Chicago. I do think that the focus on, white victims or victims on the north side or wealthier victims in the media does really influence a lot of the coverage choices, but also I think a lot of the outrage that we're sort of seeing and hearing about the concept that carjackers that there are any people carjacking. I also think that this question about getting tough on young people, and I think people see that there is an accountability gap for this offense. And they're very concerned about that. And what is happening is there's a standard script that happens when there's a problem at the policing case closure level. This happens with shootings as well. When a very small number, 5–10% of incidents are closed by arrest, and everyone is very concerned about this violent crime that's happening, police and city officials tend to relocate this problem to the county or the state. So either it's something that's happening in court, so maybe lenient judges, maybe prosecutors aren't doing their job, maybe it's defense attorneys, or maybe it's something at the state level, right? Lawmakers haven't been tough enough in their solutions and tools that they're giving to law enforcement or people in courts. And this is a bait and switch that happens over and over and over again in criminal justice policy. And it is particularly bad in Chicago and Illinois, but it's not limited to Chicago. This is a local versus county and state issue that keeps happening over and over. And it's partly about separation of powers between, the executive branch policing issue and the judiciary and legislature. There's that tension too. But what people see as there's carjackings happening and everybody's getting away with it is this idea that's happening. And to the extent that that's true, it's because people aren't being arrested for it. It's not about what happens to them when they hit the front door of the courthouse or the jail, or how long their sentence or how severe their punishment is if they are adjudicated for it. And I think that's really important to know that actually aligns with young people's developmental perception of risk too, which is, this is true for adults as well, but it's particularly true for young people, that deterrence, to the extent that actually happens for people, is located whether you're going to be caught, and so it's very close in time. That's the perception that will cause you to commit a bad act or not. When you're teetering on the edge. And caught doesn't have to mean by a police officer, it can mean by your grandmother. But the point is, fear of discovery is much more salient and the consequences are much more personal, immediate, and therefore enter your decision-making, especially as a young person. Whereas what happens in court, whether you have a felony conviction and how long you spend in prison, these are all way down the road, remote possibilities that really don't enter young people in particular's decision-making at the time. So when we respond with our policies by increasing these levers, we're not only not addressing the accountability gap that people in the community are perceiving, we're also doing something that really has no value in terms of warning people away from crime. And so I think it's important for us to know that as we're thinking about what policies might be more effective.
Thanks, Stephanie. We have another question in the line. Robert, do you want to add to that?
Yeah, I wanted to add to that because there was so many great points. Because I think this is the media part of it is huge. And I think Stephanie hits it right on the head when she makes the point that all it takes is a few high-profile cases in the North Side, per se, for something to just like all of a sudden grasp and instill a fear in the average Chicagoan. And I think that I like to think that it's not a nefarious motivation on the part of the media. That I think that a big part of it is scientific literacy or scientific illiteracy, that is, because journalists are not researchers. They write stories, right? They don't know how to fact check and understand issues of sampling bias, sampling error, this or that. But I think what's most important, though, is the way of thinking that, say, the average journalist has in covering an issue, which is to view issues and problems by looking at the behaviors of individuals as opposed to institutions and systems. And so you can try to change the media narrative all you want, but if a journalist is used to thinking about things in terms of there being good people and bad people, then they're just not capable of asking the right questions and reporting on these sorts of issues. Some of it could be police ties, sure, but I would also add, when you look at the options that an average journalist has to cover and get a quote on an article. The experts might be elected officials, researchers, and representatives from the police department. And we would like to think that the folks who are in these institutions are independent and are able to put their self-interest aside. What has happened in cities over the last several decades through the gutting of the welfare state to the influx of ultra net worth individuals donating to the police department, donating to entities like my friends at the crime lab at the University of Chicago, the interests have been aligned in a way to continue centering the police as the primary solution to problems like this. And so we can't. So when journalists get an information from a source, I don't think they necessarily see all of the connections between between all of the different parties that have an interest in an issue being presented in a particular way.
Well,
Thanks, Robert. Rebecca, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, I think that's something we really need to be thinking about as a group interested in independent politics, and what we can bring to the table to ask people to take a fresh look at things, so that we aren't always arguing about a particular sentence enhancement, but we also are looking much more at broader deterrence, and deterrence that can happen more broadly in the community, and how we can support that deterrence. So I would ask to move to the other side, if you don't mind, about, is there anything in this that will encourage us to spend some money sensibly in community, that will, anything we can take from the focus on carjacking, even if it's misplaced, that we can look at from both of you have a broad experience. I'm sure we have other questions in the chat, but both of you have broad experience with community organizations. Would you have anything you could say about what community organizations, maybe the IVI, maybe other neighborhood-based groups could take from this current interest and do something useful with it? Stephanie, do you think there's something useful we could be doing?
Well, I think you've heard all of Robert's comments, which I uplift and echo, about transparency, access to data, the questions about researchers that may or may not have ties that make it hard to speak strictly about the data without being filtered through political motivations. I would say that this organization in particular is well positioned to help hold city officials accountable to, first of all, the law. Some of the information that is inaccessible to journalists, researchers, et cetera, because FOIA isn't properly abided by. I have several outstanding FOIA requests on this issue, much less others, that have languished for a month. And it's a busy time in Chicago. It's always a busy time in Chicago, but when the CPD pays the salaries of spokespeople to present the city with prepackaged stories and PR about carjacking, but doesn't actually deliver in a timely manner the data that people are requesting to back up those stories, I think we have a real problem with engaging the city officials in terms of what it means to be a citizen who is actively engaged in petitioning your government. It's hard to know what to even ask for when you can't get information from your own government. Secondly, I think community organizations more broadly, I know that community organizations are an important way to bring people together to talk about how to solve problems and create ties between people, more important now than ever. And studies have shown that the more community organizations that there are in a neighborhood, the less violence that there is in that neighborhood, that this is actually a very protective and important part of the fabric of our civic and social life that actually does help with crime prevention too. So I think engaging with your neighbors, if you have a block club, those sorts of things too, and talking with them about issues, it's really all crucial.
Yeah, I would just quickly add to that. I feel like there's so many valuable lessons to learn from what's happened recently with carjacking. I think of it in terms of short-term things that can be done in long-term. When I think about short-term reactions, because I'm pretty sure this will not be the last time that a crime spike is going to be politicized to preserve an organization's budget. And so I think I'm kind of optimistic based on what's happened this year, because I feel like enough elected officials have, I think, had somewhat of a sensible response to not take this too far too quickly. So I think that speaks to the power of convenings, of public convenings. I mean, we're here electronically, but ideally we'd be doing this in person. Engaging the public and speaking up. I think that, that there are many who I know in the nonprofit sector and the research sector that are afraid to speak up, because they are dependent either on the city for proprietary access to data or to foundations for again, data access issues. And so I feel like what's so key in defining independence is also a form of data independence, not being tethered to these binding and constraining proprietary data agreements that effectively buy off, that purchase the silence of researchers in exchange for researchers' ability to have exclusive data over a topic that they can publish and use for their own their own individual career advancement, their own lab's individual advancement. To me, that's a key way to value independence and continue that moving forward. I think in the long term, there are larger issues here around privatization, the privatization of city services and the privatization of public safety, because it's one thing to FOIA CPD. It's another thing to actually acquire the data of a private company that has been contracted to provide services on behalf of the city. And the case in point with this is ShotSpotter, the technology that was used to detect the gunshots that resulted in the poor young kid that was killed by police. ShotSpotter, by virtue of being a private company, owns those data. The city cannot provide those data to researchers or to anyone FOIA because it's considered private property that's protected. There's all sorts of thinking and research and action in the legal sector that's needed to really try and do something about this privatization effort, because I think one of the things that is troubling about the future is that if the city continues down this path of privatization, there's actually going to be fewer mechanisms for entities like IPOs to actually call and bring this stuff out to the public, which I fear is only going to make things worse.
Well, that is something that an organization called the Independent Voters of Illinois needs to pay attention to when we talk to politicians, would be about guaranteeing that kind of independence and working against that. So I think this is a good forum to talk about that, because that should shape some of our future responses as an organization. And I would invite anyone who's interested in that work to consider joining the IVI. I have to put that in there at some point, so why not now? Because we really need to be thinking about how we're going to hold politicians accountable once they become elected officials. And that's something this organization has spent a lot of time thinking about. So I appreciate you bringing that up. Joseph, do we have any other questions we should be answering?
Well, there was a question by Stephen Stern. Is there any data on the type and age of cars jacked? Stephanie responded in the chat. She says, Stephen, sorry we missed your question. We don't have information on that yet. And I haven't asked for the model, make, year of stolen cars, but I believe some of the reporters are requesting this information. I also want to open it up to the rest of the participants. If you have a question, we are actually scheduled to go until 7:30 this evening. So if you have a question, please put it in the chat. We will get to it. Stephanie was nice enough to respond to Anne earlier by putting several of the slides that she used in her Illinois state hearing They are also in the chat if anyone wants to view those slides, or please feel free to reach out to IVI-IPO and we'll make sure that everyone gets a copy of this as well. Anne said, thank you so much, Robert, for your comments on privatization. This issue is coming up again and again in so many contexts. Rebecca, I'm gonna let you keep it going.
Okay, I would like to talk then a little bit more specifically about the political side of things, because I know that's something that Robert has spent a lot of time on, is looking at the close relationship between the police department and some of our aldermen. And would you be willing to share a little bit more on that topic with us?
Sure.
And also, oh, sorry, two-part question. And also, we are, you've done a lot of interesting work on gerrymandering political districts. And that's
Yeah.
very important right now as we're looking at some remapping. So it's a two-part question.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's more so the work that I've seen and done has been more on the relationship between the police and the mayor's office, because what's key to remember here is that the mayor appoints the chief of police. And so I think it's important to remember, while we're talking a lot about the role of Chicago Police Department in getting access to data and these sorts of things, again, I'm hypothesizing here because I haven't observed firsthand, but I would imagine that there's actually 3 city agencies probably involved. One is the law department, because a lawyer has to write up the proprietary data agreements with all the terms on it and approve it, right, and sign it. There's someone in charge of police data analytics, and then there's the representative of the mayor's office. And so what we're talking about here again is a system and a set of relationships amongst organizations. And I think that's important to view the problem in that sense, as opposed to immediately thinking that, okay, there's some evildoers who are up in some tower scheming. I mean, I think the reality of public service in the city right now, and when we're facing the COVID, is it's a really hard job. There are all of these organizations and institutions and incentives in place that it's much easier to stick with what you're doing and what you know than it is to veer off course. And so I think that, you know, the tools of thinking about problems from an organizational perspective are especially useful here. So to think of questions of like, how can we incentivize our city to want to share its data with a wider range of researchers, right? It's like, imagine, you know, all of the collective international research collaborations that went on to find a vaccine to COVID-19. Like, could you imagine if we had, a question we should be asking is, how can we build an infrastructure to support those kinds of cross-sector collaborations to address a problem like carjacking, instead of the situation we're in right now, where everyone's competing for a slice of the city budget or the state budget. With respect to wards and redistricting, you know, I'll just say that, you know, the young boy, his name, who was killed by police in the east side of Little Village. There was Aiden. He was killed on the 2000 block of South Sawyer. Adam Toledo, there we go. He was killed on the 2200 block of South Sawyer, which is in the 12th ward of Chicago. And at the press conference today, the city council member, what's his name, Cardenas, said a quote about the child had no one, right? And folks immediately were troubled by that, because it kind of made assumptions and judgments about his relationship with his parents. And while I certainly am also troubled in a similar way, I looked at that and thought, like, well, there's another way of thinking about this, that the kid also lived in a block that didn't have a city council member. Because when you look at that block historically, that block has changed wards plenty of times over the last 50 to 60 years. And if you look at the east side of the Little Village, it's carved up into tiny sections here and there, where the city council member's primary constituency is in another neighborhood. It's not in the east side of Little Village. And so this is some of the work that I've done in the past. It's calling attention to these hyper fragmented areas of the city. There are pockets in Inglewood, there are pockets in the west side, like in Little Village, where problems are allowed to fester, in part because there's just very little institutional incentive to focus on these areas that are fragmented and pushed off. And I think that while I wouldn't go as far as pitting the incident on that particular case, but I would say that that is one of the many different structures that let this kid down last week.
Okay, we have a question in the clarification from Stephen Stern in the chat. Is clarification, is the data only subject to FOIA, or talk about what type of change could open up the access to the data?
Oh, sorry. I'm sorry, Robert. I want you to talk about the data sharing agreements that social scientists and others currently need in order to do in-depth work. But really quickly, in terms of broad public transparency, I want to just highlight that, you know, during the transition to the current mayor, there was a group put together of advisors who issued some recommendations for how the city could become more responsive, more transparent, and meet its obligations. My understanding is that many, if not all or most of those recommendations have not yet been followed up on and could. I know that Matt Foya, who's Matt Topic, who's a FOIA attorney at Lovie and Lovie and a transparency advocate, has been asking for those repeatedly to happen and was part of that team. So I don't know, I think he might be a good resource to find out exactly what tweaks in the law might be necessary. But even before talking about a change in the law, it's really important to know that the Chicago Police Department violates FOIA at the state level, is recognized to have done so more than basically any other agency or entity in the state of Illinois. And so, you know, although there is many, there are many layers of transparency that can and should be improved upon. When it comes to the Chicago Police Department in particular, this is an agency that has historically rejected even following the law as a first step, much less taking what I think is a more appropriate view on behalf of the city of Chicago, which is presuming that the information they hold is held in the public trust for the benefit of the public, and it's information about the public that is owed back to the public, and that they therefore should be providing it to the people in digestible ways and in thorough ways so that the people can conduct their own research. But I know Robert has much more expert in terms of data sharing agreements.
Yeah, so I just posted in the chat a link to a really great article that talks about an amendment to the Freedom of Information Act made in 1986, which coming from Congress really set the stage for this awful situation that we're in, because it used to be that when a request was made for information of the police, that in order for the police to deny it, the burden was on the police to say and show evidence that there was an investigation ongoing that was sensitive, and therefore it couldn't be shared. Under the Reagan administration, during the height of the war on drugs, there were narratives of how the police were hampered in their investigations of all of their criminal drug enterprises. And so Congress amended the Freedom of Information Act to change the language such that the police could deny FOIA requests if the data were being used for law enforcement purposes, as vague as that possibly could be. And so what that's done is it's provided police departments with significant amount of discretion to deny, much more discretion than they had in the past, to deny investigations and or inquiries. And so I think that, again, a longer term battle here is to take on the issue of the Freedom of Information Act at the congressional level, and in order to try and deal with this issue better and more. Again, that might not exactly address some of the issues that Stephanie just raised, which is even when the police are supposed to be adhering to the law, they don't. But but I think outside pressure and intervention is necessary.
Rebecca, do you have anything else?
Well, I think that Stephanie was hinting in her last response. That was extremely interesting information, Robert, and I'm grateful for it. But I think Stephanie is interested in an issue because, Robert, you're a little notorious on this subject of the private, the arrangements for data to go to particular groups of scholars.
Yeah, yeah.
Which you have a bit of a rep on that. You have the closest thing to street rep that I know of in an academic on this issue. So I think Stephanie was hoping you were going to talk. Is that correct, Stephanie? You were going to talk a little bit about
Yeah.
these data sharing agreements?
Yeah, so I'll just chime right in. I feel like I need to find a place to post these publicly, but I and several other folks have acquired copies of some of the proprietary data agreements that researchers sign when they get access to data. So to explain at the simplest level, if you're a researcher wanting to do a research project on anything involving, let's say, police departments' use of tasers, the city will require you to sign a contract that stipulates terms of how you're going to use the data, and under what conditions can the city take the data from you, and possibly prosecute you for violating the terms of that contract. And there's a really in the copy of a Freedom of Information Act, or I'm sorry, a copy of a proprietary data agreement that I acquired through a Freedom of Information Act that was signed between the UChicago Crime Lab and the Chicago Police Department. There is a paragraph that stipulates that at any time, the Chicago Police Department can take the data away and bar that researcher from ever using data from the city ever again, and without having to give any reason. And so, as an outsider and an independent observer looking at this, that compromises one's ability to be objective, because that turns the researcher into producing what's called publication bias, where you're only going to report positive things based on what you've observed, out of fear that you won't get access to any more data if you report something else. And when I did some of my own research to see whether the Crime Lab has ever published null results, I'm not even saying things that CPD has done badly. Have they ever shown no effects? Like, this police intervention did nothing. Like, it's nothing. I mean, you would think that the police department would have cured cancer, right? If they were pursuing some sort of a clinical trial. Like, it's nothing but a positive PR coming from this enterprise, which from a scientific standpoint is the exact opposite of what you want. You want to know which interventions have unanticipated consequences. You want to be able to also have ways of reporting bad behavior, unethical behavior. And so I think that this is, I've been very outspoken on this issue because mainly from the perspective of a social scientist, because it's bad social science. And none of the work is being published in peer-reviewed outlets. Most of it is in these in PowerPoint presentations that are given at the City Club of Chicago or given to the Chicago Tribune, and again to a public and journalism that is not literate in the social science to be able to call out what's wrong with what they're doing.
I think that's a very important set of information, and I think we should stop and spend a minute and think about that, because many of us are proud of Chicago as an academic center, as an intellectual center, and you have agreements being entered into, not by any universities as universities, but these rogue centers that are not under anybody's departmental discipline, these centers entering into agreements whereby they don't tell the whole truth and nothing but the truth. they only present the positive, even when in order to get the positive, you have to ignore the context. I think that's very important. And I think that's something we have to think about um, in terms of what it means to pursue data in this very much, what seems to people of my age, very much more complicated world we live in now. But it's very troubling to hear people enter into an agreement only to release the good stuff. Isn't that what you basically have said that they've agreed to do?
Yeah, I would just make one other point that makes this so crucial, which is if nothing is done about this, and if this issue isn't brought to light, I can guarantee you, I can predict that what will happen in the next year is that the crime lab will publish a report on the police department's interventions on the carjacking issue and try to create a narrative that the police's intervention contributed to a decrease in the carjacking spike. And this is how you get manufactured results and creating the appearance of effective police interventions. And this is how an organization like the police can snoot out its competitors who are like in social services. They're trying to put alternative ways to address this problem. This is how historically you have one organization come to receive the vast majority of the funding towards addressing a particular problem. And I think that, let me just reiterate that proprietary data agreements are a common thing in government work, right? Because, you know, governments, there's privacy issues that you want to safeguard with respect to the identities and sensitive information about citizens and employees and all of that. I think that's perfectly understandable. What my position is not against proprietary data agreements as a whole, but when you're working with an organization that has, according to the FBI investigation, has a serious problem with providing facts and information and brutality, and an institution like that to uncritically accept data and the narratives coming from that institution and to embark on these kinds of research enterprises uncritically, I think is just it's wrong from a science standpoint, I think, and it's bad for our city.
Well, I think that's very important that that we separate out those things, that it's bad science, and that bad science is bad for a city that has produced some good science over the years. So I think we need to focus on that, and we need to think about how our organization can contribute to really talking about politics, issues that are political, but are also have a factual side, and how we can contribute to making sure that those discussions are as informed as possible. And certainly, I know that it's hard to whip up a lot of public interest in a topic like proprietary agreements, but I think when you see how that can connect to an issue like carjacking, it's very important, and it can help us push our elected representatives in the way that they may need to be pushed, if I can say that. It was my own personal experience to be involved in some releases to data that were done to David Olson from the sheriff's office, and it's very interesting. He got a great deal of data around 2012, up to 2012 from the sheriff's office. And since that time, the sheriff's office has stopped providing that data. And it's a sad fact, but his data from leading up to then is still being quoted all the time because people don't have the updates. And I think that that's a very simple way of highlighting how bad it is if data is a tap that can be turned on and turned off. That something, I think people have a tendency to think that because there is FOIA, we don't have any problems. Maybe you have to do a little work, but you can always get the data. And that is in fact not true. So that's just a point there. Stephanie, did you have any thoughts on this you wanted to share with us?
No, I don't. I think that you've covered it admirably. Thank you.
Well, do we have any other questions? I have to say I've been I've heard both of you talk before, but I learned a lot tonight listening to the two of you, and I'm very grateful to you both.
Yes, IVI IPO is very grateful to the three of you. And for those that are looking in the chat, Stephanie put another link. It says the good governance recommendations from the transition team are here. Not all transparency recommendations, including regarding FOIA, made it into the final report, but it's a good place to start. So we will be keeping this chat, and in this email, if you registered for this event, you will not only receive the recording, but we will also be sending some of the links that are also included in the chat. So with that, I'm gonna let Rebecca close it up. If there's anything else.
I have a question, Joseph. So a minute ago, Robert was saying he would like to post parts of the discussion or the discussion. Can he do that?
Yes, we will be able to do that.
So that's your answer, Robert. You can be as creative as you can be about posting our conversation this evening. I think it's one we really should invite other people to be part of. And I have to close out the same way I always do these topics. IVI is a place where you can really discuss some interesting topics with some well-informed people. There's an overabundance of lawyers, but of the organizations that I belong to that have an overabundance of lawyers, IVI copes better than most and keeps them to on the general track of working for better political results and using their ability to ask questions to move the conversation forward. So I would again invite anybody who's listened in tonight who isn't a member of IVI to join us as we go forward. We've had a very productive run of conversations at our conversations like this. We've looked at my goodness, we've looked at a couple of really hot topics this year so far: the bond reform, electronic monitoring, a number of issues. We're going to be looking at gambling and what's that, the far-reaching effects of that at problematic gambling. We have a whole series, an interesting series, I think, of topics coming up in the future. They may be things that you don't realize are going to have as much impact as they may have on your life. So we would invite you to join that conversation with us. Thank you very much.
And this is April membership month. So all of those members who want to renew, you can go to www.iviipo.org to renew your membership. And as Rebecca said, if you're interested in a new membership, you can also go to www.iviipo.org. It is in the chat, so please come on out. We want you. With that, I want to say good night to everyone and thank you for attending.
Thank you so much for joining us. If you liked what you saw today, go ahead and like the video down below and also subscribe to the channel so you can get notified about whenever we put out new videos about new topics that are interesting to the world that you live in. Thank you.